Mr. President, I rise to express my deep disappointment that what has transpired at the end of a very lengthy debate with regard to the Iran deal is that we have chosen, as a body, a minority of this body, to filibuster the Iran agreement. For weeks, we have been talking about how important this agreement is, how we've been debating it. My colleague from Maine, I agree with him, all of us put so much time and effort into studying it, how it is one of the most important foreign policy and national security issues that many of us, even senators who have been here for 10, 20, 30 years, one of the most important issues they will ever debate and study and vote on. That's all agreed to. And what happened? Now we're filibustering that. Mr. President, American foreign policy, our national security is strongest when the executive branch and the congressional legislative branch work together. Work together. That's when America is the strongest. That's why our Constitution gives powers to both branches of government in terms of foreign policy and national security. And yet, every step of the way on this Iranian deal of the president's, the president and his team have been dismissive of the role of the American people through their representatives in Congress. You have to remember, Mr. President, where we began. Because the only reason the Iranians actually came to the table was because the sanctions that this body, Democrats and Republicans, put on the Iranian regime, American-led sanctions throughout the world. 2 different administrations did this. Senator Corker talked a lot about the role of the Congress today and how important that was. So we start these negotiations with Congress playing the critical role, drove Iran to the negotiating table, and then when we start negotiating, the president says, nope, we're going to do this alone. We're going to go it alone. We do not need the Congress of the United States. We're going to do an executive agreement, no involvement of the American people through their representatives in Congress to weigh in on one of the most important foreign policy issues in a generation. So this body acted. This body acted, again, through the leadership of many members on both sides of the aisle, Senator Corker, Senator Cardin. We passed legislation, 98 senators, to say, no, the Congress has a role. Congress should have a role. Now, initially the president said, I'm going to veto that. We don't want you involved. I'm going to veto that. Well, this body came together and said, we want to be able to vote on this agreement. Our constituents want to be heard. There were more fronts, Mr. President. The UN Security Council voted on this deal before Congress even started the debate on this deal. Again, members of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, went to the administration, wrote the president, wrote Secretary Kerry, please do not do this. This would be an affront to the American people. They did it anyways. So now we've come to this moment. The UN Security Council and its member states have voted on the deal. The Iranian parliament will need a majority vote to pass the deal, but the world's greatest deliberative body won't. On one of the biggest foreign policy and national security issues facing the United States, a partisan minority of the U.S. Senate has decided to take a pass on even voting up and down on the substance of this agreement. Now, many of my colleagues have come to the floor over the last several weeks, both sides of the aisle, to explain why they're for or against the agreement. Been a very good debate. People focused on this issue very intently. People of goodwill having a serious difference of opinion. I disagree profoundly with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but I respect them for explaining to the public why they are supporting a deal that so many Americans oppose and impose intensely. But, Mr. President, that's been one debate. I'm not sure I've seen any of my colleagues who have come down to the floor to explain why they voted to filibuster a vote on the president's agreement with Iran. Why they voted to deprive the American people of a right to be heard through their representatives in the Senate on the substance of the deal. Not a procedural move, the substance of the deal. Why they are letting the White House continually press to usurp their constitutional authority to weigh in and make foreign policy for our country. Why they have done a 180-degree turn after voting for Corker Cardin, saying we need to vote on this. The American people and their voices need to be heard on the substance of this deal. And then voting to stifle these same voices by supporting a filibuster. Mr. President, I've been trying to see what the rationale of this is. Certainly there seems to be one that the White House said that they should be doing this in order to spare the president the embarrassment of having to veto a bipartisan majority resolution of disapproval of his Iran deal. There are other press reports saying that the filibuster happened to protect President Obama's legacy. But with due respect to the president, he will be gone. He will be moving on in a little over a year and a half. But the security implications of this dangerous deal will be something that the American people, our kids, maybe even our grandkids, will be living with for years. Mr. President, this issue is much bigger than any so-called Obama legacy. Today I've heard many of my colleagues come to the floor and say, the agreement has already been voted on. Now, I'm a new member to this body, but I'm not sure that's exactly the case. The agreement has not been voted on. My colleagues have not held an up or down vote on this agreement. They're actually avoiding voting up or down on this agreement with their filibuster. They know it, and they should be clear on this point to the American people. Mr. President, I think this body is making history during this debate. It appears that for the first time in U.S. history, an immensely important U.S. foreign policy agreement will move forward with a partisan minority of support in both houses of Congress. For the first time in U.S. history, on an agreement that is critical to our national security, the agreement will advance not on the basis of a vote on substance, a majority vote on substance, but on the basis of a filibuster procedural vote. And for the first time in U.S. history, the President of the United States sought the vote of foreign nations, including the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, in approving and implementing a major foreign policy agreement, and then he fought the vote of the American people to weigh in on that same agreement. Yes, the Senate is making history on the president's Iran deal, but it's not the history we should be proud of. It's history, I fear, that will be remembered for undermining our national security and the U.S. Constitution. I yield the floor.